object to you getting one.
And now, if you don't mind, I'm going to go into the icebox that's in for a long time. Thank you very much.
Welcome to the Trump Trials Sidebar from the Washington Post. I'm Libby Casey alongside Rhonda Colvin, James Hohmann, and J.M. Rieger, and we are here for another special episode, one day after President Biden announced he's dropping out of the 2024 presidential race. Look, we know this is not one of Trump's legal issues, although it did seem to frustrate him a little bit this weekend. So we will consider this a true sidebar to the main story, but it is too big for us not to cover. The presidential race has been upended. Democrats are forging ahead, figuring out the details of their nomination process, while Republicans are trying to figure out their strategy. They're crying foul, they're promising legal challenges, and Donald Trump went on some wayward twists and turns on Truth Social in the aftermath. Suddenly, Kamala Harris has been catapulted into the spotlight, and she does seem to have the momentum to pick up Joe Biden's mantle. We will watch and see what happens. So let's jump right in. James, it is incredible to think back to that debate a few weeks ago and all the concern over Joe Biden's ability to perform. But there was this will he or won't he all the way up to the end. What do we know about how Joe Biden made this decision?
It's hard for him to step aside. He was elected to the U.S. Senate in 1972. He spent his entire life dreaming of trying to become president. He finally got it on his third try after losing in 1988, 2008, not running in 2016 and getting it in 2020. And so I think he really did internalize the idea that he was the only person who could beat Trump. And it took a lot of convincing for him to decide otherwise. Initially, he made his inner circle even smaller of people because he just didn't want to hear bad news. But the polling became really bad. His own internal campaign polling that he was presented on Saturday showed that Trump would win New Mexico and Virginia, and that there was potentially going to be an electoral college landslide. And I think because Biden was a creature of the Senate, he was convinced that Republicans realistically could pick up in a big night for them 7 or 8 Senate seats, which is mind blowing. And so eventually I think it sort of got through to him. The money was drying up, which it really was. He was told that he would have a hard time raising money for his presidential library, that donors are going to, you're going to be seen as Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who didn't step aside, and then Roe got overturned. No one's going to contribute to a presidential library in Delaware after you leave office if you stick it out and lose. And then I think the key factor was Nancy Pelosi. Pelosi loves Joe Biden. She actually has long appreciated that Biden has given her more credit than Obama did for helping push through his agenda. But she loves the House more. And she believed, probably correctly, that if Biden was on the ticket, it would be a down ballot disaster. And so she was sort of turning the screws. I think she was trying to do it the easy way of signaling, getting to people around him, getting her allies to go out there and calling him to drop out. And Biden knew that if he didn't get out this weekend, it was going to become the hard way. And she was going to start really twisting the screws forcefully and publicly. And I think that ultimately is what persuaded him to get out. There is some question about when exactly he decided. I think he sort of basically decided Saturday he was going to get out. He has COVID, obviously, is on Paxlovid, did sort of a gut check when he woke up Sunday morning. The statement was drafted. It was very close hold. But I think there are some indications that he actually had sort of come to the recognition that this was untenable last weekend, but before the Republican convention. He met with Chuck Schumer, the Senate Majority Leader. They had a very emotional man-to-man, one-on-one conversation. Schumer impressed upon him that down ballot Senate problem and his legacy that he can't win. And I think Biden, that sort of broke through with Biden in a way that a lot of the other people that he had been talking with didn't. I'm told that they had like a kind of a long hug at the end of that. And that Biden said, give me a week. And so that got us through the RNC and to this historic occasion. The last president to step aside was Lyndon Johnson, and a lot of people have compared this to 1968, but that was March.
That was March,
and
yeah.
this is like late July, and that. Even though politics is different than it used to be, things get started later. I mean, it's a lot later than it was in 1968.
Rhonda, you were on Capitol Hill this morning. What was the mood like among Democrats as they grapple with this and reflect on Joe Biden's legacy and what happens next?
Yeah, I think everyone's still catching up to the news. You know, we're taping this really about 24 hours after we found out this news. And I think lawmakers are also kind of taking it in. Not many have returned yet to Washington because the Senate doesn't start until later this week. And the House is only in right now because there's a big hearing with the Oversight Committee. But
with the Secret Service director.
Yes.
Because of what happened
just 1
in
week
Butler,
ago.
Pennsylvania. With the assassination attempt of Donald Trump. And so she's being grilled today by Republicans and Democrats about what happened.
Both sides.
So they have a presence on the Hill.
Exactly. But from what I'm hearing and seeing is that Democrats are all falling in line very quickly. I think there are a lot of unanswered questions right now of what the DNC and the nomination process will look like. I think there are, of course, party rules that we'll better understand over the next few days or weeks. But there is a level of uncertainty. But so far, most are really supportive of this decision. I'm also finding that a lot are just like taking a moment, and it seems genuine, taking a moment to remember who Joe Biden was. He was a mentor to many of them, many Democrats. I talked to Representative Connolly from Virginia. He told me he was hired by Biden as a Senate staffer on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. So he said, I've been with him, all of this time, and this is quite an end to such a storied political career. So I think there is a moment of reflection, but most are starting to back and endorse Harris. I have been hearing, some are saying, well, we need to make this more of a democratic process, maybe have a mini primary, an open primary. Others are saying, no, we just don't have time and we've just got to coalesce around someone. And she's it. She's already been on the ticket. She was approved by delegates back in 2020 at the 2020 DNC. Fundraising money can basically get to her seamlessly. And if you create any other ideas or options, that's just going to muddy the water. So a lot of people a lot of Democrats want to really just move straight ahead.
Yeah. JM, you've been here at the office of the Washington Post all the time. So you live here now.
George Costanza it under my desk, right?
I'm going to have to see if there's like a sleeping bag under his desk later. So you've been watching so closely how the Democrats have been reacting, and there have been like key Democrats, right? There's the folks on the Hill, but then there's the folks in the governor's houses and mansions all over the country. People who could be like nipping at Kamala Harris's heels. So who have you been watching and how are they falling in line?
I think it's, to Rhonda's point, what's remarkable is how quickly we're 24 hours removed from this. And yet it seems like so many Democrats, overwhelming number of Democrats and state delegations and others are coming on board and supporting Harris here. And, if you go down the list of names that have been floated as a potential, if you go to an open convention, who could take over? Gretchen Whitmer, governor of Michigan, Josh Shapiro, governor of Pennsylvania, Andy Beshear, governor of Kentucky, J.B. Pritzker, governor of Illinois, have all come out, said they're supporting Harris. And it's a very small contingent at this point who are even suggesting this idea of a mini primary and open convention. Lloyd Doggett, Democrat from Texas, congressional Democrat, was the first congressional Democrat to call for Biden to step aside. Last night, he was saying that he would like to see an open process. Peter Welch, Democratic senator from Vermont, has also said that, but that's the minority. It's so overwhelmingly with Harris at this point. And we're in a situation now where, a week ago, everyone was talking about how Democrats are in disarray and everyone's sort of all over the place on whether Biden should stay in, what should happen. And now the party seems overwhelmingly unified in a lot of ways, at least at this moment in time.
So let's talk about why Lloyd Doggett was calling for Biden to drop out, and how did this all unfold, JM? Like, as you look over the past month, really just a few weeks, how did the calls mount, and what were the tipping point moments?
Yeah, so we're 3 weeks plus now removed from that late June Biden-Trump debate. And since then, that was when all the Democrats started coming out. We got to a point where over the weekend we were at 40 plus at that point. it did seem to me, at least, like a turning point was especially last week when Adam Schiff came out and called for Biden to step aside. We know Schiff is a close ally of Pelosi, and after Schiff, we heard John Tester, we heard Sherrod Brown, who are two Democrats in tough re-election races.
You know, one thing about Schiff was he made remarks at a fundraiser, which we were not privy to, but it leaked out right away. So it was like inevitable that it would get out. And then he said it publicly, right?
Yes.
So it was like this behind closed doors in the open bit of stagecraft going on.
Yes, very much so. And, you know, once you started hearing more and more of these kind of bigger names, if you will, because initially it was a lot of quote unquote frontline House Democrats, right? And I know you've reported a lot on this, Rhonda, up on the Hill. Like, these are folks who are in these tough districts, right? These districts that could determine control, likely will determine control of the House. And it seemed like there was a real fear. This is what the Democrats were saying publicly, that not only are we risking the White House, but we're risking, in their words, any check against a second Trump term, meaning if we lose the Senate, if we don't retake control of the House.
There was also a turning point when Pelosi was on Morning Joe, and she said, like, it's his decision to make, right? I'm paraphrasing, but he'll make the right decision. And the decision had already been made. The decision had been made to stay in the race. But it was like kicking the door open. Is that a fair way to describe it, James?
Every time it started to subside, Pelosi did something to like kick the door. I mean, it really was kind of amazing. And like it did, the debate's June 27th, and it felt like there were 3 or 4 moments where it was sort of like, okay, Biden's going to probably survive this. You know, he's dragged it out. And then like the next day, Pelosi would go on Morning Joe during a time when she knew Biden was watching TV to say he needs to make his decision. And the Schiff stuff, you know, what happens during the Republican convention, when I do think Biden was sort of like, okay, I can buy some time and turn the attention back to Trump. And, you know, no one in the House, in the Democratic side, does anything without Pelosi's okay. It is a reflection of how much she really still is in control. Even like Hakeem Jeffries, she's Speaker Emerita, but ultimately she's just a House member. And, you know, Hakeem Jeffries is taking his marching orders from her. And it's kind of amazing how she is, in a lot of ways, the most impactful Democrat of the last 30 years.
You know, I kept thinking about this children's book, Alexander and the Terrible, Horrible, No Good, Very Bad Day, because Biden just kept having these hits, like getting COVID. You know, it's just like things couldn't just not quite turn his way in the past week or so. I wonder how we'll reflect on this.
Well, I think this may be decades from now. I don't know. But I think this decision, especially if Harris wins or the Democratic nominee wins, I think he'll really be looked at well in history, because I think, given, you know, some of the things James said about what went into Biden's decision, at the end of the day, being a lawmaker, being in the White House, that's all he's ever done. He knows politics very well. If there was data presented to him, I'm pretty sure he understood if he had a chance and if he had a shot. And I really think this was one of those, you know, taking one for the team, you know, to put it simply. And I think perhaps history might look on that pretty well. But, you know.
But if he loses, if he loses, they'll blame him for not getting out sooner, for dragging it out, for like not making the transition more seamless, you know, for not setting up Kamala Harris for success. And if Biden loses, it's going to be really messy, because all the Democrats who are sort of like taking a pass now are going to like be like, see, I told you, you know, Biden will say, if I had stayed in, I could have won. And, you know, it's going to be messy. And Trump will be president. So if like, you can imagine just a real Democratic civil war in 2025 if Harris gets the nomination and ends up losing, with everyone sort of blaming everyone else. And I mean, it could be really ugly, but ultimately, you don't know what's going to happen. This is one of those things about politics.
Come back from your future ship, guys. I'm gonna pull you back.
Everything always seems inevitable.
It seems inevitable in retrospect. Yes.
Later it's going to be like, of course,
that makes so much sense. Of course that happened. Right.
But we don't know that.
Yeah, it's so true.
Yeah. But I think what you were saying, like, there were multiple moments where it felt like Biden was not going to drop out. It felt like the news cycle had maybe shifted away, but I think what he couldn't escape, he was always under the microscope.
Yeah.
This was something he could not, even when he had that NATO press conference, right? We were all covering it, and we thought at the time, we're like, okay, he was really in his lane. He's been doing foreign policy.
All he was doing was buying himself some time.
Yes.
He couldn't shake it. He was
Yes.
just buying himself more time. He wasn't overcoming the hurdle that was
Right.
his age and the appearance of like
And
not being able to, well, I mean, I'm curious to hear what you guys think about the age question, because it was both that he at the debate couldn't kind of follow a train of thought and was having trouble remembering names and stuff. But it was also that he could not do what Democrats say they want Kamala Harris to do, prosecute the case against Donald Trump. And that's where I saw a lot of the panic from Democrats like emerging, because they were like, not only does he seem off his game and like he's faded, he did not talk about Project 2025. He was not talking about, women's reproductive rights and health. Like he wasn't going after these lanes that he really could have hit Trump hard on. In addition to the fact that he was sort of trailing off sentences.
Yeah, and doesn't it feel like this is the longest amount of time we have covered a debate? Like this is the debate that has lasted, almost a month, and we're still covering it and the ramifications of it.
And Biden challenged.
Right.
Biden wanted the debate. So go ahead.
Had we not had the debate, what in the world would we be covering this week?
Well,
I
it
don't
sort
know.
of served its purpose, right?
It
It
did.
road tested
Yeah.
both candidates and gave the American people a sense of what they had in store.
Yeah.
Let's talk about Donald Trump and where he's at, because I alluded to this in our opening, but he was sort of going off on Truth Social in the aftermath of Biden's announcement in ways that didn't seem like organized or cohesive. Republicans, we were at the RNC last week, and you could tell Republicans were preparing for this to possibly happen, because as the week went on, they really were pivoting more to Biden Harris. We saw all these Republicans botching Kamala Harris's name in ways that felt very intentional and disrespectful. They were putting her out there more and more as someone to go after. And yet, Trump's message last night was kind of a mess, James. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, it felt like there's Trump and there's the campaign.
Yeah.
And so there's a couple things. One is the Trump campaign has built and devised its entire strategy against Joe Biden. Like the whole outreach to like young people, African-American men, Hispanic men, that was the age contrast, the machismo stuff. Like the strategy to win is an anti-Biden strategy. More recently, obviously because she's the vice president, they've built an opposition research book, binders full of like the best hits on Kamala Harris. And I'm sure they've already message tested with focus groups and polls, like what are the strongest arguments against her. And so they have been thinking more recently about how do you run against Kamala Harris, to the point that there was an ad that they could put up right away in Pennsylvania on Sunday night.
Which said what?
Which said Kamala Harris is incredible. She lied. She covered up for Biden. She said he was fine.
She is incredible. I thought you said she's incredible.
She's incredible.
I was like, that is not a good oppo ad. Yeah. She is incredible. She lied about like Biden's health.
Right. And she said he was
covering
fine.
it up. Right.
She's part of but Trump himself on Truth Social, and this is clearly like, this is actually what Trump wrote. He two things. The first was this insane thing about how like I should get reimbursed for all the money that I spent attacking Joe Biden because it's fraud, that I spent all this money attacking Biden and now Biden's not my opponent. But it just kind of seemed desperate, and it seemed like he didn't really have anything. And then he also said, I didn't agree to a second debate with Kamala Harris. I just agreed to a debate with Joe Biden, and the debate was supposed to be on ABC, but now I don't want to debate her on ABC. I want it to be on Fox News only. And it's just sort of like, he's
random.
like in his head, and that's not staff. That's just him. And then staff have to kind of race to catch up.
So there's the tweets or truth socials, whatever the truths. Yes. Which, I do have to say, like, I don't think most Americans are looking at Truth Social, but the journalists, we find them, then we amplify the messages, then they get onto X, formerly Twitter, yada, yada, yada. So that it does have like an echo chamber that it bounces around in. How are Republicans generally taking this news? Like, what's the response?
I actually think Hill Republicans were ready for this twist a while back. I know I saw a statement, this has been days ago, where Speaker Johnson said that he thought that that President Biden should be removed from office. If he can't run for, be the nominee, then he can't be president. Actually, one of the first Hill statements that I received after the news that Biden was exiting was Elise Stefanik. And she put out a statement saying the exact same thing, that Biden should be removed from office for the next few months if he can't run. So you're hearing that right now. I expect that to get louder, or at least, to their own base. I don't think there's anything legal that they can do, but they can certainly be on the airwaves talking about it, undermining the remaining months of the Biden presidency. And we'll see how voters react to claims like that. I've also heard that there's this idea that voters who voted for Biden in the primary have been disenfranchised because now their votes are being thrown out. So that's sort of what we're hearing from Republicans. But I really think it's also about just scrambling and figuring out how to fight this new opponent, even though, opposition researchers should have probably prepared deeply for this twist. We were talking about it weeks ago.
Binders full of Kamala Harris. Yeah, so it should be binders full, right?
But I think what we might be able to expect is that they will go after her on the border. If there is any issue that they are already prepared to go after her, it's on the border. And that's because early on in the Biden administration, she was named as the person who would handle that issue, along with many other issues. And, they're going to probably attack her to say she is the reason why there's failures at the border. So I expect that we'll hear more from Republicans on how they are going to handle this. But this. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, Jam, we're getting some mixed messages from Republicans, though, about like Biden's worthiness as an opponent for Trump, as a foil for Trump, versus his ability to stay in the presidency. Like they kind of want to always.
Well, what was interesting about Speaker Johnson over the last 24 hours plus here was he's saying simultaneously that Biden should resign the presidency if he can't run, but that suggesting it also might be illegal for him to get out, that there would be lawsuits, ballot lawsuits, right? Trying to almost have it both ways in a sense. I understand he's trying to thread a very, very specific needle there. But I think when we were all covering the convention last week, it felt like there was, and you three were in the room, but from Washington here, it felt like there was so much palpable confidence among Republicans in that room. And specifically about the fact that they thought they were going up against Joe Biden and that they could really win that anti-Biden vote, right? Because his favorability is so low. And now that's in some ways probably turned on its head at least a little bit. And any sort of momentum boost that Republicans would get out of their convention, now it feels like Democrats are maybe going to potentially get a simultaneous boost from kind of in their words, a rejuvenation atop the ticket, if you will, right? A freshening of that up. And then we're still waiting for whoever the nominee ends up being for the Democrats. Then they would also have to pick their VP. So there's almost like two cycles there to go through, right?
If you missed the convention last week, it ended on a night of machismo. The last night, Thursday night when Donald Trump spoke, it was Hulk Hogan literally ripping off his shirt. It was Dana White, who's the head of UFC, the Ultimate Fighting
Championship.
Thank you, James. I've warned you guys, I'm not a big actually, you know where my wrestling knowledge ends? With Hulk Hogan. Yeah. Like I'm a child of the 80s. Okay, that's the guy, and nothing came afterwards. Even Linda McMahon, who was like one of the few women who spoke that night, is someone associated with the wrestling world, even though she also worked for Donald Trump. So it was wealthy people, it was macho, it was Eric Trump kind of
yelling.
going through the grievances. And even the pick of JD Vance is like trying to appeal. It's like doubling down on Donald Trump, right? Trying to appeal to like white men and a little bit of macho, right? It's because of the beard. James, obviously.
Well, it's funny because someone, was talking about how young Andy Bashir looks. And I was like, well, JD Vance is like a decade younger or 7 years younger. Wow. And I was like, well, he doesn't look it. And it's because of the beard.
But the Republicans' their whole message was, that was like programming for Donald Trump. Like they built that night for him, but it was programming to give that counterpoint against Joe Biden, who they're trying to depict as frail and feeble and old. And these guys have they've got the juice, right? It's like the tea night, I think is what you called it, James. So if that's not what you're running against anymore, it's a little less. Maybe even JD Vance isn't quite the way to go. head to head with Kamala Harris.
It felt like, and we said this last week, I mean, it felt like Vance in a lot of ways was playing to those blue wall states, right? And was also kind of a continuation of the MAGA wing of the Republican Party, right?
It shows
Doubling down on
confidence.
that.
It shows like you're picking that guy because Donald Trump wants the next generation of MAGA, right? It's not, that wasn't a political pick. I mean, I hear you guys that you say it's for the sort of the Rust Belt states and the working class, but I just see it as a mini me of Trump. And so it's like you could have expanded your base by picking a woman, picking a man of color, trying to get someone from the South. Like there are different people you could have tried to get that might have given like a softer, gentler version of MAGA.
Yeah, and as I just said, it feels a little stunning that they wouldn't have prepared for that.
For the Kamala Harris potential, yeah.
It does, because again...
I mean, they've got the binders, James. They've got the binders.
They did prepare.
They
I mean, I think that they sort of, I think for a while they did assume like you can't wrest power away from Joe Biden. He's not going to actually drop.
And I didn't feel that way publicly when we went into the RNC.
And partly because, honestly, like for the last 2 election cycles, here's a point I've been wanting to make. The Democratic establishment intervened to stop what they felt like was going to be an electoral disaster. They stopped Bernie Sanders when it looked like he was on a glide path to the nomination in 2020 and made it go to Biden, even after he finished, 4th and 5th in those early primaries in Iowa and New Hampshire. And in 2024, the Democratic establishment, even though they know Biden, he's out of the establishment, they just maneuvered to like strong arm him out of the way. And I think one of the reasons that the Trump people didn't think it was going to be Kamala Harris that they were running against is because the Republican establishment has been incapable of strong arming Trump out of the way. In 2016, after the Access Hollywood tape, post January 6th, they kind of, they ended up coming back in 2024. It was going to be DeSantis or Nikki Haley, and no one could stop him. And so I think it was sort of like, it's really hard to take the nomination away from the guy in charge because Republicans don't have as much institutional fortitude as Democrats do.
Yeah. I have to apologize because my computer is like binging and bonging. And I'm like, what is the news now? What is it's been nothing. Don't worry. You haven't missed anything. Everything's okay. Everything's totally normal. All right. Well, stay with us because when we come back, we're going to talk through the mechanics of just how to replace Joe Biden at the top of the Democratic ticket. And we'll also hear how Kamala Harris is talking about the man who she has been serving in the White House with. Stay with us. You're listening to the Trump Trials Sidebar from the Washington Post. And today is truly a sidebar because we are going deep into the breaking news from yesterday that Joe Biden is not going to stay in the race for the 2024 presidency. And he's endorsing Kamala Harris. That statement came out just about a half hour after President Biden announced through a letter that he was not going to stay in the race. So let's talk about how Kamala Harris is handling this and how she is sort of growing into this moment. She spoke today. We're taping on Monday. I believe it's still Monday somehow. We're taping on Monday. She spoke Monday morning. And guys, this was an NCAA champs moment. It was like college athletes from around the country. Some of whom are going on to the Olympics later this summer, being celebrated and feted for their accomplishments. Biden was supposed to be the one doing this event. It's kind of the fun part of getting to hang at the White House. But because he's holed up in Delaware with COVID because of his no good, very bad, horrible, terrible, week, Harris got to do it. And so we're all watching her to see how she would handle this moment when she is on the national stage, not there to officially launch her presidency like she did that yesterday over social media channels and stuff. But what kind of tone would she have? How would she talk about Joe Biden? So let's listen to how Vice President Harris talked about President Biden.
Our president, Joe Biden, wanted to be here today. He is feeling much better and recovering fast, and he looks forward to getting back on the road. And I wanted to say a few words about our president. Joe Biden's legacy of accomplishment over the past 3 years is unmatched in modern history. In one term, he has already, yes, you may clap. In one term, he has already surpassed the legacy of most presidents who have served 2 terms in office.
So Vice President Harris embracing the legacy of wow, her soon-to-be predecessor. I mean, someone's predecessor, the man who will serve one term, James.
Yeah, and she's going this afternoon to Wilmington, Delaware, to the Biden campaign team, which is now the Harris campaign team. She gets to a turnkey operation. She gets to inherit the money. She's trying to claim his mantle. She's clearly right now throwing in her lot with Biden as part of this effort to get the party to coalesce around her, as is happening rapidly. It will be fascinating once she has the Democratic nomination locked up, which it seems like she will this week. How does she respectfully, carefully calibrate, hey, how much continuity, how much change? Is she going to show some distance from Biden on Gaza, for example? And I think she is going to have to say, like, what did she know and when did she know it about Biden's physical ailments and struggles? Mm-hmm. And it will be fascinating to see how she presents herself. But of course, this is not a moment for being like, I disagree with Joe Biden on the economy and inflation and the border, but I do wonder whether that's going to come or whether it's going to be more subtle than that, which is sort of like, I'm my own person. I have my own approach to politics, and how much is Biden going to campaign for? But for now, she's sort of thrown in her lot with Joe Biden.
But this is the moment to do so, right? It's like the time to do like the honorary.
It'd be super weird if she came out and
Rhonda,
said,
that's such a good word. It's grace.
That's something we don't often see in our politics anymore, but it is grace. Yeah. And, of course she couldn't go on stage and say, I'm taking this nomination and running with it. I mean, that would be off-putting to a lot of Democratic
voters. The White House,
people in the
campaign event, all the things.
Right.
But
and it also serves as kind of making her appear presidential, so.
And I have to say, the optics of that, if you saw that clip with us, if you're watching us on YouTube, I mean, she is in front of a bank of young people, these young athletes who've come from all over the country. And it was, it was a moment. It was a moment of timing and coincidence and yada, 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 but it was a moment. So a visually arresting moment. So let's talk about the process. So there are all these like delegates, and they've been pledged to Joe Biden. But as Biden releases those delegates, he has endorsed Kamala Harris. Can you talk to us more about the process of her shoring up these delegates?
Yeah, so the DNC, so there's a couple parts of this. One is they're going to do this virtual roll call vote. At this point, they're still doing it in the first week of August. The DNC is saying they have to do this because of an Ohio law that they've been granted a temporary extension for, but we'll put that to the side. We'll sidebar that. But there is going to be a DNC meeting this Wednesday to talk convention rules. So there are things moving very quickly just from a kind of procedural level at the DNC, on the DNC end of this. On the delegate end, yes, like the delegates are pledged to Biden. They can go in, they can vote. What Harris is trying to do right now is to shore those folks up so that when they get to the convention, whether they do this virtual roll call vote in early August or whether they do it at the convention in Chicago, that those delegates vote for her, that they are unbound from Biden and vote for her. It feels like things are trending that way at the moment. Those are the indications we've gotten so far from what delegates have said publicly or what our reporting has been about what those delegates are saying. But they're, technically speaking, it's a slightly more open question than it was 24 hours ago when they were pledged to Biden.
The Washington Post has a great guide. It's like a choose your own adventure of how Democrats can pick a new candidate step by step. And it takes us through that process. And a lot of it is shoring up the delegate support behind the scenes. And because Biden has given his endorsement to Harris, he doesn't just get to choose where the delegate votes go, but by granting her his endorsement, he signals to them that that's the direction. And so there's a lot of conversations happening right now among party leaders and other people to see if they can get the delegates to say, yeah, like that's who we want. We're going to go with Kamala Harris. And then there'll be the question of if they lock it down ahead of time, they go into the convention with her as the clear nominee. If they don't lock it up before the convention, they can still have done the math ahead of time to know that she's got the votes. And all signs are pointing to either way, she'd be able to do that because there hasn't been anybody else really saying, I want to firmly challenge you.
And that's why I think that's almost the more interesting question at this point in some ways, is that folks who we thought might challenge her have already thrown their lot in with her, saying that they support her, right? The Bashirs, the Pritzkers, the Whitmers, right? Shapiro, go down the list, right? People who had been thrown out there as possible, like oh, we'll put them atop the ticket if Biden steps out in a sort of mini primary open convention situation, are endorsing her. And that's very, very significant, right?
We'll also be watching to see if she does have enough delegate votes to secure the nominee, who she would say that she wants to run with her as a vice president. So that'll be something we're also watching. My phone is going off again, but I promise you it's not breaking news. Everything's okay.
We all, tighten
no,
up.
yeah,
We're on it.
no, I so apologize to all of our listeners. So, this will march ahead whether or not we see an open convention process with her as the presumptive, or if we see her lock it down ahead of time, or if we see someone come out and say they are going to challenge her. This will all evolve over time. But what we are seeing unequivocally is that a lot of key Democrats are getting behind her. So that's where the rubber really meets the road right now. What do you see in a potential Harris-Trump matchup, James?
It's going to be very different than a Biden-Trump matchup. I do think Harris will be able to activate the Democratic base more. I think she'll be able to talk about abortion more than Biden would have been able to. She'll be able to perhaps appeal to college-educated suburban women more. Maybe she'll do better with African-American men than Biden was doing. But I think the big question is, does Trump go off the deep end when it comes to attacking Kamala Harris? He's not disciplined, as we saw during his acceptance speech at the RNC, when he, I actually looked it up after. The prepared text was under 3,000 words. The final text was 13,000 words. He was just talking. I mean, he said more than 4 times as many words as were
off
written
the top
down.
of his head.
Yeah, just talking. And so, Trump is bound to say, honestly, a lot of offensive things about Kamala Harris.
Well, she may bring out the worst in him.
She might.
She may do that, which is not her fault. but that may play to his basest tendencies.
Yeah, think about when we covered the primary season way back, months ago, and remember his response to Nikki Haley,
right,
and how she was the last person standing. And we know comments he has made about women. Also, outside of Trump is, Trump supporters and some of the further right members of his base who might feel like this is open season to talk about her in ways that have nothing to do with the presidency, and will kind of churn some of that anger and hate that we've seen before. So,
which is frightening.
Yeah,
it could ultimately
it
backfire on them, because it may remind people what they didn't like about the Trump presidency. Because when we see polls, people don't like the style, and so that may backfire. Can I ask you about the VP process? Like, what are you going to be watching? If Harris does indeed lock down enough delegates to be the nominee, you'll be watching for a VP pick?
Well, the obvious, who is it going to be? Funny
Call your
joke.
mom.
Yes, I should. I should.
Joking about how Rhonda's mom does
already
everything,
knows.
right?
She probably already knows. I was actually joking with one of our colleagues a couple weeks ago that, we should maybe have some brackets out to see who would be the best or most effective.
That's a great idea.
Person. A lot of governors are on that list. I think we know more about who she may not pick than we do of who she would. I'm thinking of, Gavin Newsom was someone who was talked about as potentially a nominee or a running mate. Given that they're both from California, I think Democrats they're probably strategizing on who is going to appeal to middle America and other parts of the Democratic base that aren't, further left.
Yeah, and Gretchen Whitmer said today she's going to stay in Michigan. I think a local reporter caught up with her and, said something along the lines of, would you be
take it?
Yeah. But she's not going to be asked because they're 2 women.
Right.
Let's all hope for a day when it doesn't have to be.
That's not a thing. Yeah.
It's not. It's like no one says are they both right-handed? Are they both left-handed? Do they both part their hair on this side? It's kind of funny. But 2 women are not
that's
okay.
part of the calculus right now. I think
now
it's
2
going
Californians.
To be. Yeah,
that makes a lot of sense. I'm kidding.
Anyone
kidding,
from
California.
the same state. Yeah. I think.
I like how Rhonda polishes down.
Yeah.
There.
Well, there is the 12th Amendment.
I was just thinking that. Okay.
But it looked like Rubio and Trump are going to get around.
I know, right?
So
it's hard to be the governor of a state and move.
It's almost going to have to be, especially with the pick of J.D. Vance, it's going to have to be someone with Harris who will kind of temper some of her, she was a little further left in policies. It's going to have to be someone in a little bit in the middle. I'm almost wondering, too, if it's going to have to be someone with name recognition, because a lot of the people who are on this short list we've been talking about aren't nationally known. So I'm wondering, does a nationally known person do better, or can you sort of pick someone like a Vance who everyone doesn't know, but you're able to define them more?
fresh
So,
face.
yeah, I mean, all of this is probably being discussed in some war room right now. We will soon find out. But interestingly enough, when JM was talking about delegates and the next steps, I was texting a delegate who's actually downstairs waiting for me for an interview to give me a sense of what delegates in her state are saying right now. And I do intend to ask her about what type of VP pick would work for, the average voter.
Oh, I can't wait to hear your reporting. Well, that's all we have time for today. There's so much more we can talk about, but we'll be back on Thursday with our regular episode of Sidebar. So do tune in then. A reminder that you can find us on your favorite podcast app, and you can also watch us on YouTube. Just look for The Washington Post. We usually publish Thursdays and tape Thursdays, but we pretty much do it all the time now because there is so much breaking news. So for JM, James, and Rhonda, I'm Libby Casey. Thank you for being with us, and we'll see you on Thursday.